Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Mhm.
Today we're going to Las Vegas. And, a really heartbreaking incident happened there. It started with a home invasion and ended up with a police shooting. So,
Yeah, this is one of those cases where, we talk a lot about gray areas,
yeah.
and this one's got them
Oh, my
all over the
gosh. It
place.
really does.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of sources to sort through for this one. We've got articles from the Associated Press, CBS News, Las Vegas Review-Journal.
Mhm.
We pulled some statements from the NAACP
Mhm.
and local news reports from KTNV and KLAS 8,
Yeah.
and even some court documents.
Wow.
So
We're going deep.
we are going deep.
Yeah.
Our mission is to try to understand what happened that night and understand the different perspectives around this whole tragedy.
I think it's going to be tough to get a clear picture, but we're going to try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start with what we know for sure.
Hmm.
On November 12th, 2024, Brandon Durham calls 911. He's hiding with his 15-year-old daughter.
Oh, wow.
And there's someone breaking into his home. Terrifying. You can hear the desperation in his voice
I bet.
on that 911 call. He's pleading with the police to get there quickly.
So the police respond.
They do.
Yeah.
Officer Alexander Bookman is a 26-year-old officer with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. He arrives at the scene, and that's really where the stories start to diverge.
This is where that gray area starts to creep in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So from the police perspective, Officer Bookman goes into the home, finds Brandon Durham in the hallway struggling with the intruder over a knife. The intruder has since been identified as Alejandra Boudreaux.
Okay.
So body cam footage shows the officer yelling at them to drop the knife,
Mm-hmm.
and then he fires a single shot.
Right.
Both Durham and Boudreaux fall to the floor, and then while standing over them, Officer Bookman fires 5 more rounds,
Wow.
and Durham dies at the scene.
That's intense.
It is.
Yeah.
Now, the police union is backing Officer Bookman. They're saying that he was acting according to his training and that he perceived a threat from that knife. Their legal counsel, David Roger, actually said that the blame for Durham's death rests solely on Boudreaux, the intruder. So
Right.
Durham's family and a lot of the community are outraged.
Yeah. Understandable.
They're saying that Durham was not threatening the officer, and they are calling Bookman's actions completely unjustified and excessive.
Strong words.
Yes.
Yeah.
The family's attorney, Lee Merritt, claims that Durham was not threatening anyone.
Hmm.
And Rachel Gore, Durham's partner, said that she just cannot believe that he called for help, and this is how it ended.
I mean, that's got to be just devastating to process that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, to complicate matters even more, Alejandra Boudreaux, the intruder, had a prior relationship with Brandon Durham.
Oh, so this wasn't just a random home invasion.
It wasn't.
But-
And hold on to your hats because this is where it gets even more complicated.
All right, ready.
According to an arrest report that was obtained by KLAS 8, Boudreaux admitted to wanting to die by suicide by cop. She was intentionally provoking the police.
Into killing her.
Yes.
That's heavy.
So not only was Durham the victim of a home invasion, but he was also caught in the middle of Boudreaux's mental health crisis.
Right. And ultimately paid the price for it.
Yes. It's a tragic situation all around.
Absolutely.
It really makes you wonder, could this entire thing have been prevented if there were systems in place that address these mental health crises?
Yeah, what if there had been a mental health professional there on the scene with the police?
Right.
Would the outcome have been different? It's something to think about for sure.
Now, you mentioned Boudreaux's arrest report. What charges is she facing?
So she's facing a bunch of charges.
Okay.
Home invasion, assault, child abuse, because Durham's daughter was there
Right.
during the incident.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, one of the charges relates specifically to Durham's death. It's called disregard for safety resulting in substantial bodily harm.
Wow.
So basically, her actions directly led to someone's death.
Even though she didn't pull the trigger. Interesting. So even though Officer Bookman fired the fatal shots, Boudreaux is being held accountable for her role in the events that led up to the shooting.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about Bookman? What are the legal ramifications for him?
Well, right now he's on paid leave
Okay.
while the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department investigates the shooting, and District Attorney Steve Wolfson isn't saying much right now.
I imagine that's got to be agonizing for Durham's loved ones. They're grieving. They want answers.
Absolutely, but,
But Bookman's entitled to due process.
Right, we can't jump to conclusions
Right.
before all the evidence is reviewed.
Exactly. This is where things get even more complex because while all of this is going on, this case is really just stirring up so many emotions in the community.
Yeah.
People are demanding justice for Brandon Durham, and they're questioning if the police response was really justified.
I mean, this isn't just about a single incident. This taps into a much deeper well of resentment towards law enforcement.
Especially in communities of color.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next chapter of our deep dive, the community response and the calls for justice.
Yeah.
We're going to explore that in part 2.
We've been laying out what we know about this case in Las Vegas, but this shooting has really shaken the community there, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's really touched a nerve. It's become about so much more than this one incident.
Like what?
Well, I think it's brought up these issues about racial bias in policing the mental health system and just that breakdown of trust between the police and the communities they're supposed to protect.
Yeah, and we mentioned that candlelight vigil that was held for Durham, but it became so much more than just people mourning his death.
Yeah, it was like a platform for people to express their anger and fear and demand some kind of justice.
Like when Helen Bila asked, "Are we safe?"
Right? Are we safe?
Yeah.
That's such a powerful question. You know, when you think about it, a lot of people listening have probably had negative experiences with the police, or they live in communities where police brutality is a real problem.
What does it mean to feel safe in your own community? And who is responsible for making sure people feel safe?
It's a big question, and this case has definitely put it front and center.
And it's not just individuals. The NAACP is calling on District Attorney Steve Wolfson to file murder charges against Officer Bookman.
Yeah, and when the NAACP gets involved, it adds a whole other layer to things, doesn't it?
Because,
They're not just advocating for justice in this case.
right,
They're saying that this is part of a pattern.
of police brutality against black men.
Exactly. And when President Quentin Savour said, when people call 911, they're calling for help, not a death sentence.
Huh.
That was a powerful statement.
Because for some people, calling the police is a risky thing to do.
For sure.
And then there's the media, how they're portraying this case.
Oh, yeah. Especially when the body cam footage was released. That was a huge turning point.
People are seeing that footage in completely different ways.
Right. And that shows how evidence can be interpreted so differently.
It's subjective.
Exactly. You can have two people watch the same video and they come away with opposite conclusions about what happened.
Which is why a thorough and impartial investigation is so important.
Couldn't agree more. We need to go beyond knee-jerk reactions.
Yeah.
Look at the evidence, the training protocols, legal precedents, everything that determines whether or not what Bookman did was justified.
And while that's happening, this case is going to keep the debate going about police reform.
Absolutely.
A lot of people see this as a wake-up call. You know, like, we need to really reassess how policing is done, especially when it comes to using deadly force.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about Alejandra Boudreaux.
The intruder.
Right, she broke into Durham's house and set this whole thing in motion. And remember, she told the police she wanted to die by suicide by cop.
It's another layer to an already tragic situation.
It really highlights the role of mental health in these kinds of cases.
Her actions were driven by despair.
Totally. And a desire to end her own life.
It makes you think, could this have been prevented if Boudreaux had gotten some help for her mental health?
Right. Could Durham still be alive if there were better mental health resources in place? It's a tough question to think about.
And then there's the fact that Boudreaux has a long criminal history.
Oh, yeah.
We know this from court documents, charges in Florida and Washington state.
And they use that to set her bail at $1 million.
Because she's a flight risk.
Exactly. And a danger to the community.
Makes you wonder if she had gotten help sooner, if she'd had access to better mental health resources, could this whole thing have been prevented?
It really shows how criminal justice, mental health, and societal inequalities are all connected.
They can't be separated.
Nope. They're all tangled up together.
So we've been looking at the immediate aftermath of this case.
Yeah, the investigation, the community responses, the charges against Boudreaux,
What about the bigger picture, though?
the long-term implications.
Mhm.
What does this case tell us about where we are as a society? That's what we'll explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
It's been a lot to take in over these last 2 segments. The home invasion, the police shooting the different sides of the story, the community's outrage. But this whole thing, it really makes you think about the big problems America's dealing with, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's like
Yeah.
all these issues that we try to ignore, racial bias and policing mental health reform, that lack of trust between law enforcement and communities of color, it's all coming to a head here.
It's tough to face these things.
Yeah, it's definitely uncomfortable.
But maybe that's where change has to start, right? In those uncomfortable conversations.
I think you're right. And it's important to say that this isn't just a one-time thing. This case, it fits into a bigger pattern that's been causing protests and demands for change all over the country.
You can't ignore history.
Right. The history of slavery and segregation and systemic racism,
Yeah.
it's all still impacting communities of color today.
And that's why so many people are angry and demanding justice for Brandon Durham.
Yeah, they see this as another example of a black man being killed by the police unjustly.
And it just fuels that mistrust and fear that's already there.
So you might be thinking, okay, but what about the facts of this specific case?
They matter.
They do, but you can't separate those facts from the bigger picture, the social and historical context.
It's like you're trying to understand a word, but you don't know the language.
Exactly. You need that context to get the full meaning.
We have to talk about race in this case.
We can't avoid it.
A black man was killed by a white police officer. And that brings up a lot of tough questions.
It makes you think about racial profiling, police brutality, and how black and brown people are treated differently by law enforcement.
And even if we put aside the idea of conscious bias, we all have those unconscious prejudices.
Implicit bias.
Right, those assumptions we make without realizing it.
And those biases, they can absolutely affect how people see things and make decisions.
Yeah.
Even police officers.
And that's why things like body cameras and independent investigations are so important to try to prevent those biases from causing harm.
We also have to talk about mental health resources and how to handle these crises.
Alejandra Boudreaux, she was in a mental health crisis. She wanted to die by suicide by cop.
And it ended up costing Brandon Durham his life.
If there had been a mental health professional there with the police, could things have gone differently? Could Durham still be alive?
It's a question that's going to stay with us.
We need better mental health services, and we need to train police officers how to deal with these situations.
People in crisis, they need help and support, not just force.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to make things better to prevent these tragedies from happening?
It can feel overwhelming, right? Like, these problems are so big.
I know.
But there are things we can do. We can start by educating ourselves, talking to our friends and family, supporting organizations that are fighting for police reform and racial justice and better mental health care.
We can hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. Make sure they're enacting policies that are fair and transparent. We have to stay informed, stay involved. Don't let these issues fade away.
And we have to use our voices.
Yes. Speak out against injustice. Demand change. Support those who are working to make the world a better place.
This has been a tough case to dive into.
It really has.
And we're left with a lot of questions.
More questions than answers sometimes.
But sometimes asking the right questions is the most important thing. Recognizing how complex these issues are and being committed to making things better. That's how we create change.
So that tragedies like this one become less and less frequent.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We know these are difficult things to think about, but we believe that facing them head on is the only way to make a real difference. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep pushing for a better world. We'll see you next time.